Welcome to The Industry. I'm John McElroy, and I've spent my entire career reporting on anything and everything about the global automotive industry. Over the years, I've learned a thing or two about how this industry works. I've also made a lot of connections with executives and experts all around the world who really know their stuff. And that is what this podcast is about. Talking to the insiders to learn what's going on behind the scenes. On this episode, I'll be talking to Joe McCabe, the CEO of Auto Forecast Solutions, who explains why Chinese automakers are about to go on an export binge for global domination. But before that, I'm going to sit down with Matthew Vacharampal and Terry Wojciechowski from a company called Caresoft Global, which tears down vehicles for competitive benchmarking. They have come up with some amazing insights into what legacy automakers need to do to take on the EV startups, especially Tesla. And that's coming right up. Matthew, Terry, great to have you guys here. So many things to talk about. Terry, you know, you and I were talking a little while back, and you described yourself as a corporate anthropologist. What do you mean by that?
John, we've done so many benchmarking exercises here at Caresoft. We have over 25 vehicles totally torn down on our floor. And once you see several vehicles that have all been designed by one OEM, and you look at the design, you come across, I refer to it as industrial anthropology. I don't know if we made up that word or not, but just by looking at the design, you can infer what the organizational structure is of the group that made that vehicle. You can understand something about their VDP, their vehicle development process, just by looking at how the pieces and parts come together. You can just in your mind see the different groups that have been involved and which ones have been integrated and which ones haven't. And so, you know, looking at the designs, you can pretty much tell quite a bit about the company.
So what do you mean? Like, you know, we often hear people talk about how companies have different silos. Even within engineering, there's different silos. Is that what you mean?
That's exactly what I mean, John. You know, when we're looking at the designs, we're looking for design fitness. We're looking for the efficiency of the design. And one of the areas where a design may be suffering from an efficiency perspective is the degree at which it was integrated. How well were the design integrated? So you can do an extremely good job within the functional silos that we typically define in the automotive engineering space, but they all have to mingle to some degree. And so the ability for the companies to do that, and integration is hard work. I mean, it's just, you've got to work the interfaces, you have to work the nodes in a special way. And so, you know, some have extremely strong the functional silos, and you can tell, but they may not cross over. They may not be operating at the nodes real well.
So when you say strong functional silos, you mean certain parts of the engineering group probably has more power than others and has more say in how things go together?
Sometimes, but sometimes I'll just say they're very good at what they do. I do brakes, I'm excellent at brakes. I do emissions, I'm great at emissions. I do seats, I'm great at seats. But you can see, you know, one area where you can see this really manifest is when I see brackets, right away you start to look. These two parts needed to operate together. They needed to be somehow connected. And if they weren't in the design process, you have two engineers designing their parts very well, but they need to interact and they don't. And so now you get to pay a third engineer to come in and make a bracket to bridge across them and to hold them all together. So that bracket is, you know, it's a form of waste. It's mass, it's cost, it's a burden on the design that if you had the opportunity to integrate it differently, you could perhaps avoid.
Yeah. Matthew, you've discovered some really interesting things, some really good insights as you tear down all these vehicles and do competitive benchmarking. And one of the things that you've pointed out to me is that the EV startups, especially Tesla, operates very, very different than legacy automakers What would you tell the legacy automakers they need to be aware of?
Well, I think the biggest observation we make is that about Tesla, for example, the Tesla Y, we have analyzed 4 Tesla Y vehicles since they were launched in 2020. The pace of change is so fast, and every time we analyze a vehicle, they are very, very different. They are continuously making changes and improvements compared to traditional automakers who look at a model year and they release changes once a year, if possible, or often only at launch. So big difference in the clock speed at which Tesla is operating compared to other OEMs.
You know, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, certainly in Detroit, they made a lot of engineering changes on the fly. But then Toyota came along with the Toyota production system and the Toyota product development system. And as you know, Toyota freezes the specs a year before job one so that all the suppliers, all the engineers, everybody's on board. They know when the car goes into production exactly what everything's got to be. How do you think Tesla and the other startups are getting away with making these design changes on the fly? I mean, isn't that going to hurt their quality?
Well, it's a fine balance, right? If you the pace of change of technology is so high, I don't think we have the luxury to freeze a design for 3 to 5 years and say we're only going to focus on quality. It's optimizing multiple variables. That's very, very important. You can't just go because customers are hungry for change. They're looking for new technologies, so we have to implement change. Second thing is, importantly, with all the inflation and the environment, the macroeconomic situation with Ukraine and gas prices and everything, the costs are going up. So if OEMs do not make changes and the entire supply chain cooperates with that, we're going to profitability is a very, very important factor because if you're looking at 7%, 8% inflation, the operating margin of most OEMs on an average is less than 10%. So you need to make changes to keep up and take cost out of the product.
Terry, you spent your whole career at General Motors, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and I'm not trying to pick on GM here, but it's
No.
A great example of a legacy automaker. Do you think they can make these kinds of changes, of giving up on freezing specs and going to design changes on the fly?
You know, John, I remember a couple of times in particular where I came across some information about the days of yore when I was at GM. I would walk the lawn at Concours d'Elegance, and I would see things like 3 and 4 spare tires mounted, on a body outer. And you'd say, well, that's impossible. And it's like, well, they did it. And back in the day, there was, this, like you were mentioning, the rapidity of which we could make changes. And that was really, marketing was really at its peak, when the auto industry started to really bloom after the war. And it was like, oh, you don't have fins? My gosh, you have to have fins. And so the next year you get fins. Well, then you have fins, but no chrome. Oh my gosh, you have to have chrome. And so it got this economic engine turning and this auto turning. And the changes that we made, I found that was amazing what we used to do. But then, as you said, a lot of, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of focus had turned toward quality, fit and finish, all types of, quality and warranty type issues. And, it was viewed that change was an enemy of quality. You had to be extremely judicious and careful. And in the auto industry, you'd need to. I mean, the failure mode effect of doing something wrong can be extremely significant. And so it's incumbent that we do the job well. We're not creating safety problems or legislative type problems or quality warranty type issues. But what you can see is with some of the new startup OEMs, a couple of major differences. One is the fact that they don't really recognize a model year change as much as the traditional. We have these the stakes in the ground that we're going to have a model year change here. And, oh, by the way, everybody in town is going to come and see the new vehicles delivered to the dealership. If you're running your company more like an e-retailer where you're just buying something off the internet, it's like, hey, if the next one can be better than this one, that's the one you're going to get. And so not really constrained, past metal service and having two vehicles sitting on a lot next to each other that are different that's pretty much mitigated. Some of the enablers also that the startups bring is a higher reliance on math and on the validation, the discipline in their math models, and the degree at which they're willing to.
So you're talking computer simulation here?
Yeah. The computer simulation from our designs, and then being able to, model durability and fatigue and noise and vibration and all the things that we can tell on the computer, as opposed to having to build these prototypes and do all the physical testing. To be able to do that now, just using these math models or these computer simulations. So we can crash a vehicle just as easily on a computer as we can by running one into a wall. And so the better those models are made and the more fidelity in that model, the more you can rely on those to help you. The other thing I think going for the OEMs is, some of the early customers were more of a beta kind of audience. They wanted the latest and the greatest, and some of them willing to wink at a few things like the fit of a door or something along that line, which they're getting much better. And I think the over-the-air updates is a big game changer. They're able to make continuous improvement changes nightly, and sometimes do. And so, that also is an enabler to help go fast. So changing the tried and true methods and relying more on some of these is what's important to get the automotive clock speed, as Matthew mentioned, more aligned with an electronics clock speed, which moves so much faster.
So Matthew, you think the better math models are the answer here? Because, I learned quite a bit about quality in my career. I got to meet Dr. Deming on several occasions, and what they always told you, or he always talked about, is don't make changes. When you introduce any kind of change into a process or a product, you're introducing variability, and variability almost always leads to some sort of quality issue. So is it math models that the legacy automakers really got to spend more time on to make, more frequent design changes and still keep their quality up?
So, John, as in most things in life, there's no perfect answer. It's always a balance. So is not making changes the answer? Absolutely not. Is making changes every day the answer? No. What we see with the West Coast OEMs is they come from a technology mindset. And so be it software or be it OTA, software-enabled architectures, they're continuously adapting to change. So same way, if you look at the physical realm, they rely on a lot more on virtual models, and their ability to take risks is much higher with the West Coast OEMs. So if you just take, for example, Tesla, they had, let's say they were profitable after 12, 13 years. For 13 years, they were financially allowed to take risks, because there was capital willing to bank on them. And the traditional OEMs are measured by a different yardstick, where people are not going to allow them to make as many risks as some of the newcomers. Okay, so that's kind of the balance. So coming back to the West Coast OEMs or some of the newer startups, they do a lot of validation, a lot more validation using virtual models, whereas some of the traditional OEMs spend a lot more time in the physical world, which takes more cost, more time. And it boils down to fundamentally, what level of risk are you comfortable with taking? And where is that engineering judgment? Where is that business judgment? It comes back to the risk-taking ability of that leadership. So if you look at Tesla, which is the model that everybody looks at, Elon Musk is an entrepreneur who takes risks. believes in something and shoots for it, yes, there are mistakes along the way. There are countless issues along the way, but in the end, you get there. So it comes back to, are you willing to take the risk and to have the leadership and the resolve to stand behind it?
Great points there. Let's talk about some specifics. Jerry, you've pointed out that legacy automakers, I mean, we call them legacy. They've been around for over a century. They've built up all kinds of processes and rules and regulations and hiring talent that thinks a certain way. But you've pointed out that they're carrying over specifications from their internal combustion products into their EVs. And you showed me a great example that I love you to talk about on the structure inside the instrument panel and how Tesla, for example, does it different than the legacies. Go into some of those details because I found it fascinating.
Yeah, and John, it's an extension of the previous conversation, the time and the amount of change. A lot of the processes we put in place over 100 years' time were because issues occurred, and so we put in some safeguards so that'll never happen again, and something else occurs, so we put in another process, and so the larger, more bureaucratic, and the more times you've struggled, you've put those safeguards in place, and at the end of the day, the process is what the process is, and the startup isn't burdened with that. I think the interesting thing, especially as the industry shifts so drastically to the EV realm, there's a ton to learn. Everybody's learning on how to make an EV that performs well, that satisfies the customer's needs, that's legal and compliant, and one that can be made profitably. That may be one of the biggest challenges, actually. But in this, the thing that I've really been amazed at, I think I knew it just from cliches and previous experience, but there's an awful lot that needs to be unlearned. And I think this idea of unlearning things is a cliche, but it's true. And when you look at some of the designs and some of the EVs, and you start to look at the design efficiency, the design fitness, you start to come across, you can see where the design has been driven by specifications that came about, by need, but they came about in the internal combustion engine world. And as a result, they may not be applicable to an EV. And to your point, in the instrument panel, behind those beautiful instrument panels is what we refer to as a cross-car beam. It's a pretty utilitarian-looking design. They're very difficult to do. You can imagine they have to add structure to the vehicle. They support the steering column. They support airbags and such things. All the instrumentation. It does a lot. And when you look at it, they're kind of like an octopus. There's just many pieces, and they're all welded together. Quite amazing. Well, when you look at a Tesla or some of the other startups, the same we could say about a Rivian or a Lucid, this cross-car beam, which used to be made of steel, some people go to the extent of making cast magnesium to try to get the mass down of that beam. But when you look at this new one, it's just an extruded aluminum tube with some co-injected plastic brackets to hold
on the EV ones. On the
EV, yeah, on the startups. And it's like, that is amazing. When you look at it, it's one of those things where the beauty is in the elegance is in the simplicity of the design. So, wow. Well, sharing that with certain engineers who have been making these beams for their career, we've actually had engineers look at it and say, that won't work. But you're looking at one, and it's like, we bought the car, we drove it here, believe me, it worked, But when you start to probe as to why doesn't it work, and you realize that they have specifications that are vibratory in nature, okay? The first resonance has to be above a certain frequency range. That's one of the requirements, and that won't do it. So, okay. But when you probe a bit, why do you have that requirement? And you realize, well, it's because there was a point in our history where we took engines, we turned them sideways, and we started carving off cylinders. And so we had 4 cylinders, we had 6 cylinders, and they are dynamically very active. They vibrate just by the nature of the design of their crankshafts. You can put counter-rotating shafts in and stuff and quell some of it, but you can't get it all. And they shake. They have firing frequencies and they have internal imbalances, and they're up there just shaking away. And so we had to learn over the years was how to essentially make that harmonious. How can we put this vibratory engine in here, but make the cabin quiet and smooth? You don't want the steering wheel jumping. You don't want the IP vibrating or the seat. You want idle shake and these types of things. And so we came up with modal separation. Certain things had to be in certain frequency ranges, and there were no fly zones around certain frequencies that the engine would make. We learned about impedance mismatches through mounting and torque axis mounting and all these wonderful things. But we've carried some of those, such as the modal displacement and frequency range for these things, and put them in an EV. But that motor just hums. You can't get a much smoother powertrain than that motor up there spinning. And so it's like, we're taking and we're dragging these requirements from our past and our legacy and applying them in places where, quite frankly, the physics doesn't warrant it. It's really not necessary. So a lot to learn, a lot to unlearn. We've actually seen certain vehicles, EVs, that were made from internal combustion vehicles that still had, carbon monoxide seals, in the vehicle. So that's terrific. No CO intrusion. It's an EV. There is no CO. We're worried about something that doesn't exist. So it's the Wild West right now. There's a lot of learning going on, and it's an exciting time to be part of the industry. That's for sure.
So, Matthew, what do you do with this knowledge with your clients here? I mean, there's a need for systems engineering. There's a need to unlearn things. We're seeing some car companies maybe bite the bullet and make a big change. So Ford, for example, is spinning off its EV operations. They're going to call that business unit Model E. Renault over in Europe doing a very similar thing. They're calling it Ampere. But what advice would you give to the legacy automakers as to the things that they've got to do to be able to compete with these startups? As you pointed out, they have a much higher level of tolerance of risk, and they're going to be excused that by their own investors to take that kind of risk. So what advice do you give the legacies?
Well, that's a tall order. It's a tall order, John. I think so let's look at it as a business. Okay, the EVs have the luxury of having capital funding them. So if you look at the startups other than Tesla, I don't think any of the other startups are making money. Of course, BYD is making money, but it's been around for a while. At Tesla and BYD, but if you look at Lucid, Rivian, they're all on the way to profitability. So let's look at the traditional OEMs. What's the strength that they have? Let's not forget that they have a business which is making money today. Okay. So it's important to make sure that that is what feeds you today. So you need to keep that running well. At the same time, the world is going to be different in 5, 10, 15 years, and we need to, we need to be able to juggle both hands or both mouths. You cannot just forget about the one that's helping you invest for the future. I'm addressing this just to traditional automakers. So you have to worry about these people are important. This business is important because that's what's allowing you to invest in the future. The future involves an organization that is very much a learning organization that's willing to change, that's willing to move fast, that's willing to take risks. As I don't know whether Caresoft entered the benchmarking space, the focus was just on data, more data, more data. Today there is terabytes and terabytes of data available, but the problem is it's not being processed. And what we have done is we are working with several OEMs, over 8 OEMs right now, working with them to bring this knowledge and what actions can you take about this specifically to improve your technology, to reduce your cost, and how can you be world class and compete with the best of the best. And so it's quite a few things there in terms of, okay, you have to maintain, you have to make sure you take care of the past, you have to be prepared for the future, and how do you learn for the future and compete. So a lot of things to be done in this as we face this new world.
Yeah, well, I like what you're saying there, because you're right. I mean, there's all kinds of information and data out there, but putting it into something that makes sense, knowledge, is what really counts. And that's why I wanted to talk to you two today, because I've learned a lot from you. I think your knowledge is superb. And I'd encourage others in the auto industry to look into what you're doing there at Caresoft Global. So Matthew and Terry, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, John. Thank you.
I love that idea of being an industrial anthropologist and being able to figure out how a company is organized just by looking at the cars that it's designed. I also like that point that they made, that not only do legacy automakers need to learn from the EV startups, they also have to unlearn so many things that they've been doing over the last 100 years. Coming up next, Joe McCabe, Auto Forecast Solutions, and what he sees going on in the market right now. Joe, so great to talk to you as always. Big news this week. We got September sales for the U.S. market. The SAAR was up sharply. Sales look pretty strong, but you say don't count on that. You recently were speaking at the Southern Automotive Conference, and you said the U.S. market, or the North American market, never going back to 17.8 million. European market never going back to 22 million. Boy, that's pretty definitive. Why are you saying that?
Yeah. And John, thank you for inviting me today. Always a pleasure to speak to you as well. You know what? We're seeing a shift in product portfolio. We're seeing a shift in new players. When we look historically back in, let's say, 2009 and 10, and we hit the recession, all the same players went in the recession, and all the same players came out of the recession. When we look at the high watermark in North America at 17.8 million units in 2016, there were 14 vehicle manufacturers. In 2029, there's 28. Now, they're not all GM Ford size, but those extra 14 are disruptors. And when you have a disruptor in this market, they might not be high volume, but if they can convince a consumer to buy a new product in this electrification space, that's going to be a game changer. Layer on top of that we do see lower volumes. This idea of converting an IC customer one-to-one immediately to a BEV doesn't make any sense. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process. Yes, we've been talking about 12 years of pent-up demand, I think, for the last 12 years. But the idea here is that people are going to get themselves in a situation, they're going to say, interest rates are high, I can't get free money anymore, I want to get out of my lease now because I have value in this thing, and I'm going to hold on to that car maybe another 5, 6, 7 years. So you're going to have people, I think, are going to get out of the car market on a buying side for maybe a midterm to see how all this thing washes out. You layer in poor inventories, you layer in high cost of price and everything in between. And everything is idea that if the manufacturers can get there with less volume, but more profit per vehicle, then they solve their only customer, which is the shareholder. Hopefully shareholder value responds in kind and the vehicle manufacturers win. Unfortunately, the sales drop and the suppliers that are supplying those vehicles potentially lose because they can't deal in volume anymore.
Wow. We have seen inventory start to build up a little bit. Companies are talking about the chip shortage starting to ease, but you say more pain is on the way. What do you see coming?
Yeah, I mean, look, our forecast right now, we're in the mid 14 million for this year. Right this second, we're going to call that a mild recession. That's our mild recession story. There are a lot of forecasters out there on the banking side that are calling for a full recession. Let's call it a major one next year. So right this second, we're going to bake in a mild one. We're going to get back in maybe the 15 million unit range of production next year. But if that major recession really hits and consumer spending really drops and Christmas season really indicates how people's buying power is diminishing, we're going to push our forecast out 12 months. So you're going to see 2023 potentially look like 22, and then not this hockey stick recovery after that, a full push of our forecast. So we're not going to see a full recovery by definition till 25. Right now, we're looking at 24 as somewhat of our path to recovery, but our outlook in 2029 has us in the low 17 million range. We're taking 600,000 units out of North America volume-wise from our high watermark, as I said, with more players. So it's very disruptive what's going on.
In fact, talk about more players. You're pointing out the Chinese are going to be coming here at some point, too. In fact, you're saying they got to get out of China. They got to expand into other markets around the world.
Absolutely. There's too much protectionism right now. The new IRA is really designed to eliminate or mitigate our risk, let's say. The IRA is basically saying battery and mineral cannot come from any foreign country of conflict, whatever concern, starting in 23 and 24. And that's where all it's coming. All our batteries and minerals are coming that direction. So it's, we had this conversation in the 80s with the Japanese manufacturers. They brought the right product at the right time. The Korean manufacturers brought the right product at the right time. The EV players are going to come here with a really substantial electric vehicle. The Chinese are going to come here with a very substantial electric vehicle. Have great warranty. It's going to offer something that consumer is willing to look at. When I say the consumer, I mean the new consumer, the more emotional buyer, the more socially motivated buyer that they're really trying to target, our kids and our grandkids that they're targeting. But it's not an if, it's a when the Chinese are coming.
Well, when do you think, though? Because, they could have been here already, but, from what I'm hearing, they just think the political climate is not right to come to the U.S. right now. So why do you think they're going to come here?
Yeah, 100%. But here's the thing. When the political climate is moving the fact of the build where you sell mentality, and when a consumer looks at a product and doesn't care who builds it anymore, they just know it satisfies what they need at that point, whether it's a Tesla or a Tesla fighter or something in between. A lot of people don't even know where the cars are made or who even makes them. We used to make the joke about the Envision. We say, hey, we see all these people driving an Envision around. We say, 100% of them come from China, and they don't know it. But they don't care at that point. So the idea of the new consumer that's going to be more accepting of different cultures, obviously, more understanding of if something comes in, it's a high value, they'll discount the fact that it's Chinese owned. It's a generational shift going right now into the buyer's habits, I think. And when they open those doors and they bring in something really cool and it can fight a Tesla and it's got 100,000 plus mile warranty and batteries are, leased or free or it's cheap price, it's really going to change the model. We always say no way it's going to happen until it does.
In Europe, I think there's going to be a political backlash against the Chinese. And the reason I say it is, there's going to be a lot of jobs lost. People who are making internal combustion engines, there's thousands of jobs that are going to go away. Mm-hmm. The only way that you can possibly, as an economy, backfill that is convert, some of those jobs or create new jobs on the EV side. But if Chinese imports are pouring into Europe, I think there's going to be a backlash. In fact, Carlos Tavares, CEO of Stellantis, is saying, hey, we got to slap tariffs on these guys because otherwise we're going to be in trouble here.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be planting a flag of manufacturing. It's not going to be an import model. We're going to cap off China at 30 million units, which is ridiculous volume in terms of vehicle production per year. But that's because what's going to satisfy their local domestic market. The import strategy, you don't want to ship electric vehicles on ships. We've had one case where a barge catches fire and people go, wait a second, maybe it's not a great model. So what's going to happen is they're going to plant their flag in terms of manufacturing footprint. They're going to not hide behind, but put value behind how much employment they're going to put into it. And now you have a Chinese manufacturer. We look at Volvo, owned by Geely, right? Now, Geely does a really good job in staying arm's length away, lets Volvo get, do what they got to do and doesn't get interfered, but it's still a Chinese-based ownership where profits are going a different direction. Last few decades, the Chinese have forced any kind of partnership in China to be a European or North America and 50% owned by a Chinese domestic owner. Tesla's the only one that's allowed to go in there as a vehicle manufacturer with no Chinese ownership. So I think it's not we're going to export our product. We're going to plant our flag at that location. We're going to sell it as, hey, we're going to be an employer and we're going to be here to help. And people go, okay, thank you, Chinese. You're going to give me a job. VinFast is doing it. Vietnamese company comes in, never built an EV in their life, but you throw a few $1 billion in the Carolinas, and all of a sudden you're a viable player, and people will give them that viability and actually take them serious. So this is a really changing landscape for those of us, you and I have been in this industry for quite some time and saying, I can't believe this disruption is here to stay. We think it's here to stay.
Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen in China? I mean, as you point out, there's over 100 car companies, over 100 brands. I mean, it's way too many. And everyone keeps saying, well, there's going to be consolidation and the marketplace will resolve this. But I don't see that happening in China. As you know, I mean, these plants are there for one reason, to create jobs. And in many cases, they're owned by municipalities or provinces, and they're job creators. They're not going to let them go belly up. So how do you think this is going to get resolved, or is it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the consolidation is a reality, but it's not going to be a loss of job consolidation. Our argument's always been the Chinese government subsidizes a lot of these manufacturers' existence. So if you make 25,000 units per year, they're going to say, sorry, you're under our threshold. So the 25 are going to get together and say, hey, let's do 50 next year. And all of a sudden now they're going to be above a threshold. The Chinese government can't risk a drop in production volume. Their goal is global dominance. And to get there, they have to show that they weather COVID, which they are weathering. They're going to weather semiconductors. They're going to weather all stuff. Now, whether they're putting 10,000 vehicles on a parking lot somewhere, hey, that's a different story. But they're going to keep that employment up, because if someone sees this drop, they can say, see this whole China thing, it was a flash in the pan. So the government's going to consistently push. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to become energy independent. The more BEVs they can push, the less they have to subsidize imported oil. And if they want to make their own dirty electricity, hey, they have all the right to do so. But they're going to get there with a BEV strategy. They're going to reduce content of a vehicle, no engine, no transmission, and they're going to push and keep that global dominance view in sight. And I think that's what they're going to do. They're not going to allow employment to drop, but they're going to find a way to make these companies start working together. I mean, it's still a communist country, and it still has control from a higher power of the government. So I think that's what the shift's going to be.
Joe, always love touching base with you. I always learn something. So thanks. Really appreciate your time.
Well. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning in today and listening to what Matthew and Terry and Joe all had to say. I've got other experts I'd like to introduce you to, so keep an eye out for future episodes. For the industry, I'm John McElroy.